Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to give a quick general introduction to our panel this afternoon entitled Smart Environments. My name is Mona Khafif. I'm an associate professor here at the A School, and I'm co-directing Smart Environments over the last 3 years together with Jeana and also with the support of Zihao Zhang, who I would like to thank at this point. Before we start, with a brief overview of our initiative, I would like to thank Debjani Ganguly, Jack Shen, and Alison Booth, who were spearheading a larger NSF grant initiative entitled Human Informatics Lab. And Alison agreed to say a couple of words of the original umbrella project.
Hello, I'm Alison Booth. I've been an English professor at the University of Virginia for a long time, and I'm academic director of the Scholars Lab in the library and academic director of the graduate DH certificate, which any graduate student at the University of Virginia is welcome. And we have quite a few architectural history graduate students in the DH certificate. So yes, as Mona says, the Humanities Informatics was co-directed by me, by Jack Chen, and Debjani Ganguly. It was mostly centered in the Institute for Humanities and Global Cultures, and in the orbit of arts and sciences, but very interdisciplinary. So the Provost Strategic Initiative Fund supported a bundle of humanities labs, and Humanities Informatics was one of them. And it's verging on an oxymoron. Informatics, oil and water kinds of feelings some people have had about what it means, the tradition of informatics and the tradition of humanities. But of course, it's on the edge of thinking about digital humanities. So it was an interdisciplinary series of talks, workshops, courses, uniting faculty, staff, and students. Among the questions we were asking, the relationship between human culture and technology, the circulation of information, readings, research, and learning concerned. There were other groups who've already had their presentations, AI, drones, algorithmic bias, facial recognition, histories of information and media, emerging methods of data collection. Questions are, what does it mean to be human in the age of information? Can we keep up with the consequences of smart environments, neural networks, digitization of millennia of text and cultural heritage? So smart environments is one of 4 working groups, and winding up what would have been a symposium in April. So in September, we've had a series of final showcases. I hope this is being recorded. And all of these events are available from the other groups as well by the end of all of this. So thank you so much for letting me participate in your fascinating work. Over to you.
Thank you, Alison. I want to give a very quick overview of what happened in our last 3 years. Smart Environments was dedicated to the topics of data, policies, and design. The Smart Environments project was hosted by the A School across all departments and challenged the social equity on urban spatial implications of data informatics. Over the last 3 years, the project, or a group of scholars across UVA grounds, contributed to architectural, ecological, social, and urban policy perspective to a broader Humanities Informatics initiative, as Alison just mentioned. During the last 3 years, we created annual sequences. The first one we entitled Data Dialogues, where we invited colleagues within the school and across grounds to contribute to discussions around these topics of policy and data and design. These were partly workshops, partly lectures, partly panel discussions, and we are still hoping to translate this at some point into a curriculum component here at the school. The second year, and this is what we are going to discuss today, was dedicated to what we called data projects, where we supported through small seed funds 5 data projects that are going to be presented today on the panel. And basically the last sequence was what we called the discussion, which is a symposium Originally, we were looking forward to have an exhibition down in the Nog and a glass of champagne at the moment in our hand. Life changed a little bit in the last months, as you all know, but we hope that this virtual symposium and also the exhibition that is now online on our website can replace a little bit the in-person interaction that we were looking for. Jeana, I think you can take over from here.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this Friday afternoon. As Mona said, we've enjoyed and are really very grateful to the larger Humanities Informatics group for sponsoring this rich dialogue with many colleagues across grounds and across the A School. And this has been something that really started as a conversation and has evolved and welcomed new members through the evolution of the effort. So we're very happy today to have two of our brand new faculty at the Architecture School, Katie McDonald and Jose Ibarra, agreeing to host the discussion of these presentation of 5 projects. So the way that this panel will run, we'll give quick presentations. 5 different groups have worked on 5 different projects, and they will quickly run through a little preview of their work. Hopefully we'll have time at the end for Katie and Jose to host a short discussion. So I will quickly introduce them and then we can get started. Jose Ibarra is an architectural designer, researcher, and educator whose interdisciplinary work focuses on the intersection between architecture and environmental uncertainty. He's an assistant professor in architecture at the University of Virginia and director of research of CODA. He received a B.Arch from Cornell and a post-professional M.Arch from Princeton University, where he was awarded the 2019 Robert Geddes Post-Professional Award and the 2018 Howard Crosby Butler Fellowship. Jose has been an editor of Pigeon Magazine, the Cornell Journal of Architecture, as well as Association, and currently he is co-author and editor of a forthcoming book, Werewolf, the Architecture of Lunacy, Shapeshifting, and Material Metamorphosis, set for publication in 2021. Katie McDonald is an assistant professor of architecture and co-founder of After Architecture, a practice named to convey the built environment's impact on cultures and ecologies. McDonald's research critiques conventional building practice, which face new life cycle questions and overextended supply chains amid the current environmental crisis. Her work explores how technological agency can help reconcile the intentions of designers with the irregularity of natural materials and processes, leveraging data and feedback to reframe authorship. Recent projects focus on rapidly renewable materials and include an installation at the Oslo Architecture Triennale 2019 and a forthcoming installation at the Knoxville Museum of Art. After the panel today, we also, of course, have a keynote address by Dietmar Offenhuber, and we're very excited to hear from him. So we will be pasting that link at the end of this session and hope you'll continue to join us after the discussion. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Jose.
Thank you so much, Jeana, and welcome everyone. Thanks for the warm introduction and welcoming. And I'd just like to say that Katie and I are extremely excited to be joining not only UVA, but also this panel and the conclusion of this fantastic exercise that has lasted 3 years. So I'd like to welcome all the audience also today to the presentations, to the panel discussion and the keynote lecture that will take place later. As your moderators today, we would like to take a second to ask our panelists and the audience to just consider again the title of these collaborative efforts, Smart Environments. Architecture and so many other disciplines are now focused on examining what has been the backdrop of the world for so long, the so-called nature or the natural environment. The natural environment has in fact been a problem to deal with in many cases, instead of complex circumstances for us to become with. Even the same title, Smart Environments, suggests perhaps 2 different attitudes. One, that environments are already smart and that it's our disciplinary role to complement that intelligence with projects. Or 2, that environments can be made smart through data and technology, in which case environments are currently lacking some mode of intelligence. These juxtaposing views have been the subject of a lot of media attention recently as our world undergoes drastic changes, including a return of nature to the streets. And today we just hope to continue thinking about this with you all. So to begin the presentations, I'll briefly introduce our panelists for the evening. I'm only going to mention names and roles at the moment, but I'd like to refer you all to the Smart Environments website that has been shared on the chat, which will be posted throughout in case you need to reference it back. There you can browse through the projects and read through the short bios of my fantastic colleagues who are tonight's speakers and really the stars of the show here. So we have 5 groups presenting projects today, as Mona and Jeana mentioned. The first group is Grounding the Cloud, represented by Ali Fard, Assistant Professor in Architecture and Urban and Environmental Planning. The next group is Ostenda Illuminata, which is led by Mona El Khafif, co-director of Smart Environments and Associate Professor in Architecture and Urban and Environmental Planning. Andrew Monshine, Associate Professor in Urban and Environmental Planning. Eric Field, Director of Information Technology and Lecturer in Architecture, and Zihao Zhang, PhD candidate and lecturer in Landscape Architecture. The third group this evening will be Material Epidemics, Health, Segregation, and the Built Environment. This group is led by Jeana Ripple, Co-Director of Smart Environments and Associate Professor, as well as Graduate Program Director in Architecture, and Andrea Hansen-Phillips, Assistant Professor in Landscape Architecture. The fourth group is Algorithmic Cultivation, led by Brad Cantrell, Chair and Professor in Landscape Architecture, Robin Dripps, T. David Fitzgibbon Professor of Architecture, Lucia Finney, Distinguished Lecturer in Architecture, and Emma Mendel, Lecturer in Landscape Architecture. And last but not least, the geosocial image of the city, which is represented by Guoping Huang, Spatial Analysis Laboratory Director in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Richmond. Aside from this stellar list of group of participants, several other scholars and researchers have also been part of the Smart Environments team during its different phases. You can also find this list on our website. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming all of the participants with virtual claps.
Okay, I'm gonna do the now classic thing. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to, in the beginning, make sure to thank Jeana, Mona, and Zihao for inviting me to be part of this wonderful group and for most of all organizing the event as a whole. Jose and Katie, thanks for moderating the wonderful introduction and also for these kick-ass backgrounds that we have, kind of mix between Matrix and Tron, which is not easy to do, but I think it's working nicely. Okay, so today, as Jose mentioned, I'll be talking about Grounding the Cloud, a project that was supposed to be part of the exhibition, and as a whole, it was conceptualized as a physical exhibition, but because of everything that we've been faced with, it's migrated actually back to the cloud. So it's kind of interesting to be critically looking at spaces of the cloud, on the cloud, and in the cloud somehow. But in general, let me see if there we go. The project starts from an innate interest in infrastructure and infrastructural systems, what Lisa Parks calls the stuff that you can kick. This research is more precisely interested in the spaces and material dimensions of the cloud, as I mentioned, and we basically wanted to know what is the cloud. Some of the problem we've been having in defining what it is really stems from the fact that it remains quite hidden from our immediate spatial imagination, which the word cloud actually refers and alludes to that vagueness of the concept. So in a sense, the cloud is becoming increasingly more difficult to kick, no matter how much you really want to. And that act of kicking, or in other words, understanding its materiality, how it operates within society, is very important in understanding any phenomenon. And it's certainly true in the case of infrastructural systems. But to kick the cloud, we first need to locate it. This reframed the question for me to where is the cloud? A simple question which becomes quite complicated once you consider that the current bundling of data-mediated spaces in our cities are actually masking and obfuscating an extended geography of extraction, processing, storage, and transmission that underlie the ideologies, practices, and forms of the cloud, and by extension, tech-driven urbanism, smart urbanism being part of that. This is what we call the enabling geography of the cloud, a global operational landscape which is dominated by cables, data centers, extraction sites, tech campuses, manufacturing plants, and dumping sites that quite literally tether the cloud to the ground. By mapping and drawing these sites and their contextual relationships, this project aims to produce a spatial understanding of the cloud and the geographies that are activated through its continual expansion. The operational landscapes of the cloud can be roughly categorized into 4 parallel territorial strata, each of which handles a critical aspect of the cloud's operations. First, we have farms or purpose-built large-scale data centers and their associated energy projects, pipes or the physical networks of delivery and control of data and data flows, mines or the extractive sites and operations of data devices and the materials that go into those devices. And finally, enclaves or the corporate headquarters of technology companies and their bounded smart city initiatives. Given the limited time that we have today, obviously, I'm only going to share with you some of the material that we've done on farms as an example. The regions and zones of the cloud are continually materialized through data centers, which are in turn grounded in the specificities of the geography and location in which they're in. Locating the physical infrastructure of the cloud, like data centers, entails a spatial logic based on a geopolitical cocktail of economic, political, and environmental incentives. Specifically, the locative strategy of data centers is based on a set of gold standards. Whether a region is earthquake prone, bound to political instability, or climatically extreme will be initial decisive factors. Energy reliability, good fiber optic connectivity, proximity to major markets, and so on and on, are each playing important roles in terms of where a cloud provider decides to plant its data centers. In locating its nodes, the cloud has followed in the footprints of previous rounds of capitalist spatial production. Cloud firms often locate themselves on top of the ghosts of manufacturing economy or within the spatial vestiges of military-industrial complex of the Cold War. North Carolina is among states in the US that has lobbied heavily for data center investments, a rush that began with one of the first purpose-built Google data centers in Lenoir, North Carolina in 2007, and which was followed very quickly by the likes of Apple and Facebook, which themselves were also followed by other tech companies that have contributed to the build-up of a data center geography in the States. Even though the cloud is understood as a distance eliminating technology together with internet as its kind of larger framework, the specificities of geography and sociopolitical dynamics bound its infrastructure into identifiable clusters. For instance, this is the heavyweights cluster of Google, Apple, and Facebook data centers that are right now outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. While each data center project has its specificities in terms of design and location, they also share a lot in common. Direct access to highways and locations in elevated or otherwise hidden places is a common trait. Also, access to an available workforce and an infrastructural surplus is a must. This is quite evident in the Google project in Lenoir, which was heavily promoted as a replacement for the jobs that were lost as the result of furniture manufacturing plants moving overseas. In addition to political and economic willingness, the locational strategies of data centers mean that the local geography, infrastructure capacities, and the local built environment each play a part in deciding where and how a data center is to be located. And finally, beyond its locative strategies, typical data centers' defensive spatial strategies use things like topography, vegetation, and hard barriers like fences and walls to cut it off from its immediate context while maintaining heavy dependence on regional infrastructures of power, water, and data. So in a sense, we can clearly see that space and its construction plays a critical role in grounding the cloud. Yet, as Keller Easterling would say, we as designers, architects, and landscape architects are very much under-rehearsed in this performance. Grounding the cloud, this project that I just briefly talked about, is an initial attempt in creating a holistic understanding of the spatial imprints of the cloud as it reshapes geography in its own image. This is also key in understanding the cloud as an organizational model, which is based on the centralization of computing resources, as opposed to a physical infrastructure that we can kick. As I said, this was originally designed as an exhibition, but it's migrated to the cloud on the website that you see the link of on screen. There's much more material on the website. And I would love to hear your comments, feedback on it, as it is quite a work in progress still. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I'm continuing with the second presentation. The project that I'm going to present is entitled Ostenda Illuminata. As Jose mentioned earlier, it was conceptually co-authored by four faculty and researchers, Andrew, Eric, Zihao, and myself. It's interesting, despite this very different scale, it has a relationship to the project that Ali just presented, as I believe that we just added a micro confetti to your to the hardware components that are a part of data-related environments. I want to start the presentation maybe with a quick overview how the project was initiated. A couple of years ago, we received a grant that was came from another research project, and we were interested in looking at what are we going to do once we get data? How can this data collection be more valuable for community members specifically? It emerged from a project that we called community-centered urban sensing, and we were considering how to design with the collected data that specifically is the light data that we received and documented on our website. It was a kind of a mix between a plant that received a sensor and therefore became an artificial element, also the idea of a smart street light or even a data fountain, a place because we have now data access and Wi-Fi might become a place where people and the community can meet. But what was essential to the project is that data collection was in the ownership of the community and that it was concentrating on environmental data that were able to create more intelligent communities, and that the data was also stored and featured real time in the internet. Oops. Oh, 1 second. Ostenda Illuminata is a Latin term and means revealed illumination. And our project obviously is not the only species that looks at how responsive architecture can help us to understand the immaterial or the things that we can't see. There are a lot of precedents that we looked at in the past. And what was really important for us was to understand that the project that we wanted to design is neither a top-down nor a purely bottom-up approach to the smart city, but something that negotiates in between, that is owned by the community and can help us to become more intelligent neighborhoods. Our hypothesis was that urban technologies are not just a problem of sensor choice, but also of form, processes, and control. with an eye towards creative production, placemaking, and enabling of new capabilities within the community. To test these arguments, Ostenda Illuminata utilizes open, low-cost standards for sensing and technology embedded in architectural elements that can be distributed in a variety within single systems and in public spaces. The form finding process was somehow a challenge because a project like this can have any form. We went through a series of iterations, but was essential at some point. Once we committed to a geometry, we also understood that this geometry, in this case, we chose the circle, was also related to the technological components that were driving the project and allowed for the light illumination of data. We went through the project is currently staged in the nave, in the NOC, and we went through classical digital publication processes that really thought about how are we serving, how are we accessing, how are we cutting these materials on site, and how can we create an ecology that on the one hand side is able to host all the technological components to connect the piece to the internet, and also allows the elements to absorb data from the environment, to be responsive, and to communicate those for those who are circulating around the project. Here are a couple of shots from the NOC while we were working there in the last weeks. It was really interesting in form of the design process, because normally you think as a designer you're done once the hardware component is ready to go. But at the end of the day, we discovered that this was just half of the project, that writing the codes, initiating the sensor kits, and making all of this work was another component that was added to the project. For us, Ostenda Illuminata is an ecology of types. It is not a single object. It is a kit of parts that can be put together out of different components. It is as much a sensor system that can absorb environmental data as it is a system of public furniture pieces. It creates islands and aggregations and a hierarchy that allows all different species that are living on this hardware or this landscape, if you want to call it like this, to create different forms of data and to communicate this in the web interface as well as in the physical experience of the project. So on the one hand side, I mentioned we have a solid base of the project. It consists out of these plateaus, from larger islands to smaller islands. Some of them are seeding devices. And we have a whole system of typologies like plants that are living on the island system, equipped with different sensors that are able to communicate and absorb different environmental data. Here's an inventory of our current species and technologies. It is literally comparable with the ecology of a forest, where we have moss. Moss is equipped with sensors that allow us to be basically the smart street light when you walk through a park. It is motion sensor, and when you approach it, the moss is illuminating. We have the earth holes. The earth holes were our maintenance opening area so that we can access all of the tech equipment. We have shrub, and shrub is a species that is responding to the immediate local data. In the first prototype that we built, it is related to sound data. And we have the tree. The tree is the most developed species in our ecosystem. The tree is connected to the internet and absorbs data that comes from the shrub over a longer period of time in order to understand aggregation and to allow for the monitoring of these data sets. We also have the website, as I mentioned, that Eric put together over the last 2 days. You can go to the website and see how the data is visualized and aggregating over time. There will be a time slider that is added to understand how, for example, sound pollution is occurring within a neighborhood. This is a placing currently in the NOC. It was important for us that this becomes a siting where you can interact as a visitor or somebody who's walking through the public spaces, that you can interact with the piece. It is designed for the human scale and for human appropriation, and the human becomes, or even the non-human in form of animals, becomes a part of the ecosystem. Here once more the rendering that shows the different tech components, the connection to the internet through LoRa connectors, and the collection of data. As I said, And I mean, Ali mentioned this already. This was meant to be a physical exhibition, and we didn't give up to fabricate her. We also needed to see if these sensor kits are working, and for us, this is only a work in progress. This is how Ostenda is currently staged in the NOC. So if you have time and you are around in Charlottesville, please come by, because obviously the most important thing is to interact physically with the installation. We also discovered while building her that she is a little bit of a strange thing. She seems, partly because the seating elements have a soft material, they're penetrated with light elements. They somehow she seems like a creature from the ocean. Sometimes you have the feeling she's a plant or something that is alive. And for us as a design team, it was really important to facilitate this. As we discuss and think about how internets of things are a part of our daily life, we need to make them visible. We need to make them to be a part of our environment. And we also need to be able to interact and to even say no to them. Because what is currently happening in the top-down smart city is that sensors are distributed within the urban environment, that citizens are even not aware of it, and that data is collected and not in the ownership of the community. So the Ostenda project is meant to bring these processes, to visualize these processes. The data will be in the ownership of our test communities. And she's also there in order to resist potential data collections that we might suggest within our ecosystem. Obviously, we started to think about, is this something that could live outside somewhere in public spaces, which is very important to us. And I just want to give a couple of examples. This is under the Gardiner in Toronto, a place that was just recently redesigned from a residual landscape to now a public space, but obviously a place that has a lot of sound and air pollution. So being aware of these potential hazards is a very important part that should be a part of the public design space. Obviously, as I mentioned, she is a part of a public furniture family, and therefore can also be a part of the public space design and plan. But we also think there are very serious components, which is, for example, ongoing air pollution in cities like Cairo, where the current air pollution is even increasing and getting into areas that are dangerous for the health. But also here in the US, as you know, events like the wildfire has radical and critical consequences for the air pollution and the air quality, sparking up the qualities for public health, for air quality indexes to a very hazardous and dangerous condition. As we worked on the project, we received another grant entitled Network Public Space, and we are currently building on a test bed here in Belmont, where smart infrastructures will be tested together with the community. We have, at the beginning of the grant, we made sure invested into the LoRa network together with Smart Civil, and we initiated the neighborhood association and also community input group. So this project is going to continue in the next 2 years. As such, Ostenda Illuminata is a network of stakeholders, and it's extremely important that we discuss these projects together at one table and that everyone can participate in as a form of co-author. I have a video. I know that I'm a little bit over time. I just want to show, and I'm talking and thanking everyone while I'm presenting the video. It's one minute. I hope it's coming. I just wanted to visualize quickly the current coding and how Ostenda is reacting to data. So in the background is noise. We are in the moment when noise goes over a specific level. First the shrubs are going to be activated, and then the trees are absorbing the aggregated data and performing visibly. We are using this project at the moment more as a test bed, which means it's going to create a library of codes, a library of sensors, a library of species that are going to be a part of it. Ostenda is going to be literally pulled apart. She's going to be a project that will be redistributed and will be also a project where citizens have the right to say yes or no to components that are a part of data collection. If you have time to come by in the NOC, it would be fantastic. At the moment, she's simply there waiting for you. And I want to finish the presentation with a credit line. The project started among the 4 authors that I mentioned in the beginning. But meanwhile, we created a large team that is now also branching across not only UVA with colleagues from the Data Science Center, Data Science School, but also across universities. So we are working together with Philip Speranza, who did a lot of smart infrastructures together with the city of Barcelona. But at this point, I just want to really thank 4 of our research assistants and students who worked on the project over the last week tirelessly: Davis Eddy, Darcy Engel, Gabe Andrade, and Meng Hong. Thank you.
Thanks, Mona, and congratulations to the team. Okay, let me get the next share started. So this is a collaboration between myself and Andy Hansen-Phillips. And we have spent a lot of time in our discipline examining and measuring the environmental conditions and impacts of architectural and landscape design. We've arguably not spent enough time examining the social conditions and impacts. This project is research that's largely based on a forthcoming book that I'm working on called The Type 5 City, Codifying Material Inequity in Urban America. But what's also most relevant for the collaboration between Andy and I is whether and how effectively we can communicate more complete histories and more varied social impacts in the built environment. Building codes claim to protect public health, safety, and welfare when dictating rules like the material character of buildings and cities. So then we have to ask ourselves, what is material welfare, and is it measurable? And if so, who determines its value? Defining material welfare has historically been quite subjective, with definitions and priorities inverting over time depending on the power and agency of the groups impacted. So in Chicago, following the fire in 1872, material welfare for the immigrant labor of the North Side Burn District meant autonomy to conceive of their own material preference and their own property. They marched in the streets of Chicago protesting wood bans. A century later in Tampa, material welfare for African-American neighborhoods was determined by the white ruling class, defining a neighborhood level measurement rather than an assessment of a single property. In fact, a court ruling in 1959 claimed that the condition of a single structure is immaterial. A majority of buildings are, and if a majority of buildings are in very dilapidated condition, it constitutes a menace to health, safety, morals, and general welfare. So we're going to just show briefly how this has played out in these two cities, Chicago and Tampa, and then how it's related to some broader trends in contemporary building today. In Chicago, neighborhood investment became largely defined by this series of lines. First, the fire limits, later redlining, led to a condition where one can identify neighborhoods defined by dominant material character. The material character of these neighborhoods has a strong correlation to some of the typical measurements of neighborhood welfare, like abandonment rate. So you can see here that the abandonment of homes is more closely tied to material than it is to many of the other lines, including red lines, fire limits, or social vulnerability indexes. Abandonment is sometimes described as having a disease-like behavior. Once it spreads to a certain degree, homeowners or rental property owners have a disincentive from further investment in properties, and it spreads further. In Tampa, material character was much more pixelated as the city grew. Instead of these materials defined by a singular, neighborhoods defined by a singular material character. However, despite this rather even distribution of the same type, it was used as a justification for blight only in specific neighborhoods. As in many cities in the 60s, while blight was described as a material condition, the material reality suggests judgment based on race and fiscal opportunity for redevelopment. This map outlines the neighborhoods targeted for urban renewal in the 60s and shows the dates that sewer lines were added, with the Black Business District, the triangle in the middle, being one of the last neighborhoods to receive a complete sewer infrastructure. We're finding similar patterns of lacking urban infrastructure and investment when looking at other patterns like street lighting, road paving, access to public parks, access to transportation, suggesting that material degradation was a symptom of inadequate municipal investment, while it was weaponized as an argument for displacement. Rather than investigating in urban infrastructural improvements or renovations, the Black business center called the Scrub in Tampa was demolished in 1974. Demolition was part of federal funding of urban renewal, but locally it's remembered as a response to late 1960s race riots following the police shooting of an unarmed Black teenager. If it sounds like history is repeating itself, so are the patterns of underinvestment in affordable housing. The public housing redevelopment site was recently built upon the former site of the Scrub, pictured below. Construction of multifamily stick frame was paused midway due to construction defects and leaks. An independent building inspection found at least one window installed upside down. This type of construction I talk more about in the book as being a form of planned obsolescence. In Charlottesville, white business centers and some white residential neighborhoods were protected by municipal fire limits. The adjacent Black business center, Vinegar Hill, was largely excluded from the fire limits. However, it was one of the few neighborhoods where African Americans were permitted to live that did not occupy low topography. Relocations in both cities, both Tampa and Charlottesville, required families to move to lower topographies, still within more vulnerable construction types, but now with less access to transportation and the city center. Now, to place this quickly in the context of some broader contemporary trends, today 93% of new single-family house construction and 68% of new multifamily construction is wood frame. In many cities, the patterns of construction and material vulnerability align with other forms of vulnerability like climate threat or industrial adjacency. For example, in low-lying land in New York has much higher percentages of wood frame construction than the rest of the city. In Hurricane Sandy, wood frame construction accounted for only 20% of the buildings in the inundation zone, but 80% of the damage. We're finding correlations between material, low-lying territories, mold violation reports, and asthma rates, even while cities pressure FEMA to pull back its expanded flood designations and insurers leave the coast. Another broad trend that we're seeing is the lower lifespan of wood frame construction when compared to more labor-intensive and upfront energy-intensive forms of building. So materials like masonry and mass timber, which require more upfront investment, may be reframed as an opportunity for employment and lower long-term energy costs. I'm also studying the labor demographics implicated by architectural material choice. For example, the Brick Masons Union was one of the first, and until recently, until civil rights litigations, one of the only unions to accept Black Masons and protect wages and working conditions equally with white Masons. In many vulnerable communities, upfront investment in labor and wages may ultimately pay off in multiple forms of long-term sustainability. Andy's going to quickly talk about some examples of how she's beginning to make this data more accessible to tell these stories.
Thanks, Jeana. So we are beginning to look at some areas of Charlottesville, which are investigating the city's racialized topography, which Jeana mentioned previously. I'll note that there are several other scholars at UVA, as well as at the Jefferson School, including Jordy Yeager, Barbara Brown Wilson, and Beth Meyer, who are concurrently investigating some of these issues as well through maps and atlases. Somewhat in collaboration with these scholars, we're looking at how 3D interactive mapping can help to build a more complete picture about systemic racism, material welfare, and environmental health in Charlottesville and in other cities. The maps that you're seeing on this page were created by Kevin Klosterwill and Lydia Fulton using data collected from Sanborn fire maps and other historic and contemporary data sets, which were digitized over the summer and fall of 2019. Just to take a quick look at these examples, they're juxtaposing conditions of racially segregated neighborhoods in Charlottesville with investigations into zoning and topography to see, to try to suss out how neighborhoods may be disproportionately sited in areas that are prone to flooding or other disadvantages. And so we're looking at ways of using interactive and 3D mapping to continue to highlight some of these conditions in Charlottesville and elsewhere. Next. The first example I'll show of a way that we are thinking of working these visualizations, and I'll note that this is a project that is still in process, so I'm going to be showing some examples that have been inspirational to us. This first example is actually a project by Xun Liu, who is one of the organizers of this symposium. This is a project entitled A Third Vision, which she created for my seminar in fall 2019. It's a seminar called Scripting Civic Engagement, where we were looking at, Jeana, could you play the video again? Where we were looking at ways of using web mapping and data visualization to further design investigations. And so what you're seeing here is the use of a technique in the Mapbox library where you can overlay three-dimensional color gradients onto an interactive map of the city, in this case, Shanghai. And so some of the maps that you saw previously of Charlottesville, we'd like to continue to expand and look at ways that we can highlight certain conditions using these three-dimensional gradients. Next. This project was also created in that same Scripting Civic Engagement seminar last fall. This is a project by JJ Lai called Marijuana Justice. And JJ used a technique also by Mapbox called story mapping, which allows the map to interactively change position to call out certain sites based on geocoordinates. And so as you scroll through different chapters within this story, the map will automatically change perspective and position. This is a technique that has been used to great effect by Jordi Yeager, who I previously mentioned, who's working with some examples from the city of Charlottesville, as well as Andrea Roberts at Texas A&M University, who has a great inspirational project called the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. And how we're envisioning that this story mapping could play a role in material epidemics is that it allows us to juxtapose both bigger picture, holistic views of material quality and environmental health in the city, as well as highlighting individual stories and moments of discord or tension between the data and what we're really seeing on the ground. So this final slide is a short screenshot video of the prototype, the material epidemics prototype that we created last year, using data from New York City, where the three-dimensional model that you're seeing is showing the different type 1 through type 5 construction overlaid with a set of 3D buildings in New York. And you're seeing the same information shown on various static LiDAR images on the left. And so we're working with different types of mapping and visualization to really think about how to, as we mentioned previously, share a bigger picture about what's happening with material health and welfare, and also who that impacts.
Great. I think our team is next. Is that right? Can everyone see the screen? Yeah, great. Just want to extend, so my name is Brad Cantrell. Just want to extend our thanks to the Smart Environments group for their support. Our group is myself, Robin, Lucia Finney, and Emma Mendel, with help over the last year and a half from Chia Li, Colleen Brennan, Hang Liu, Yu Chen, Sun, Wei Shen, Yu Cheng, and Kazu Shimomura. So we had a lot of people with their hands in this project. And it's been an amazing, not only kind of interesting discussion around the platform we've been developing, but also just collaboration amongst a lot of like minds, but really kind of wide-ranging discussions. So to get started here, so emerging within the context of vast automated agricultural systems alongside the revolutionary kinetic machinic sculptures of Jean Tinguely and the urban infrastructures for non-humans created by the likes of Jeremijenko and others, what we're calling our algo cult explores the interrelationship of the human, the machine, and the plant. So this project is situated in the context of what we're framing as a fraught relationship between humans and other species. And three aspects of this relationship are particularly relevant, particularly today. The pandemic, along with other novel coronavirus permutations that have not yet been documented in humans. What we're seeing is an upcoming mass migration of species seeking cooler temperatures within the expected extinctions that might accompany this. And the changing relationship of humans to plants as agricultural automation is employed to optimize production while a changing climate makes 20th century agriculture practices more risk prone. So this kind of idea of agriculture, this more kind of playful atmosphere of artists like Tinguely and Jeremijenko are a big part of this inspiration. So current studies have revealed that recent epidemics have been initiated at sites where urban areas and food sheds have expanded into areas formerly uninhabited by humans. As human populations increase, so does the interaction with animals that are potential vectors for pandemics. Yet human economies have only recently discovered that massive potential problems that can arrive through relentless urban expansion that disregards existing populations of non-human species. With a changing climate having a strong current effect on weather and predicted to have more deleterious effects in upcoming decades, species of plants and animals will have to travel to mountainous locations and toward the poles to survive. In some places, such as the American West, this will be difficult, though possible. Obviously, species move very slowly. In other places like the American East, settlement and infrastructure patterns will combine to make it nearly impossible for many species to escape extinction. Meanwhile, the presence and role of wild species is often ignored in the human spatial and economic planning. Meanwhile, the relationship of the farmer to his or her plants is changing with the increasing automation of agricultural practices that produce more food in less space and with less hands-on human involvement. In viewing the large acreage of automated agricultural greenhouses and precision agriculture across the world, one can conclude that the work of the farmer is to increase and optimize production will now involve more code writing and less hands-on interaction. The growing environment is becoming more controlled with hospital-level sanitation practices, stabilized temperatures, humidity and moisture levels, with more scripted, more defined, and more data-driven interactions. The give and take between the farmer and the plant and the in-person observation of plant characteristics is likely to become more one-dimensional, giving way to statistics and protocols for increasing yields. The relationship between top-down, the relationship becomes top-down, directed entirely by humans. Non-human species then are increasingly subject to human actions and interventions and progressively subject to harm and potential extinction. Yet these same species are part of the complex and fragile ecosystem that supports human life. So part of our work here in this project has taken on a couple different roles. And so while it's looking at these concepts of new forms of agriculture, It's also then taking on this tradition of things like bonsai and the ideas of espalier or topiary. So algorithmic cultivation is a project that poses some questions about this fraught relationship between the human, the machine, and a plant species. Is it possible to have a conversation with a plant and thus develop a relationship more empathetic than instrumental? Can a plant comment on a range of human interventions in the viability of other species? And what can we learn from observing the interactions between a plant and an agricultural robot? The interaction between the plant and the robot is framed in the terms of modes of pruning. So as we're moving forward, we're developing essentially a platform. And in this platform, we have two major components. The first is a series of planters that allow us to contain certain plant species and isolate their roots and the growing medium, one from the other. And the second part of this project and the platform is this robotic gantry that can move across the plants in order to begin to maintain them. So our initial kind of take on this is about pruning. And so this is to be tested through shearing, a form of pruning used to maintain a hedge, basically. Shearing involves a planar cutting of leaves and branches. This can be in an XY plane cut along the top of the plant. XZ cuts along the sides, typically rotated out at the base to allow light to reach the leaves, and the potential for YZ cuts between the individual plants to create vistas through the hedge. Hedge shearing typically occurs once or twice per year, yet in this case, the shearing will occur more often, though in differing planes each time. So the platform we've developed, as I mentioned, has these components. And as we've been working on this, we've developed this. So the container system is basically these series of 12 by 12 by 4 boxes that allow us to hold growing medium. And they then can be situated either in either direction within this robotic gantry. Some images of this here. And our initial setup is in Campbell Hall in room 118, where we're also developing a whole series of tools. But this one platform is really about this method of interacting with plant material. So you can see some images of this. And all of this is, we'll have to say all of this is still in the works. So we're still developing the gantry, we're still developing the lighting system, but we have many of the components in place at this point. The robotic gantry is essentially functioning like a two-axis plane, which can move across the planters and use different effectors in order to do the pruning. You can see some images of this here. So if I move forward here, so part of this then is to begin to imagine how we can use this platform to use either external data or kind of local data to then begin to develop these interactions. And part of our conversations has been very much about, as we mentioned before, this conversation that we might have between this living medium of the plant and this and the data that would be used to maintain it, and to begin to develop a dialogue that doesn't just favor optimization, so kind of the fastest and most robust plant growth, but that can ideally be an interaction between the two. Part of the way we've begun to envision this is really looking at the portions of the plants that become the kind of main centers of its growth, and then how those centers might transform over time with different data sets. And so in this case, really kind of altering that kind of middle zone of the plant and allowing this kind of edge, similar to how you might take on a kind of long-term bonsai project in order to kind of keep the kind of core of that plant healthy, but still being able to kind of trim those kind of edge conditions. The kind of larger system we've developed, which I showed some image of before, is this. And ideally what this becomes is a space where, us as a team can begin to experiment, but others can also begin to take on ways of operating the robotic gantry and developing ways of interacting with the plant material. Here you can see this setup, and the idea then that different forms of data might then begin to retransform this kind of these plants in order to alter their growth over time. So, with the intention of promoting an empathetic discourse between plant and human, we're questioning the very process of language formation. While there is some support for language being an instrumental response to need, we're more interested in theory suggesting a process of almost random sounds that the human finds compelling in some way while finding additional pleasure in observing the response of others. The ensuing, almost emergent process of back and forth, sound production and response, reaction becomes the means by which a sophisticated and poetic language comes into being. As a way to instigate a form of language between such apparently disparate conversationalists as a plant and a human, we are therefore testing different data feeds, not because they are expected to produce an outcome desired by the human, but instead using data more as an unfiltered random catalyst for provoking the feedback loop of stimulus and response, out of which a shared discourse would develop. The sharing will be informed by this data, and in turn, the plant's response will be measured by sensing various physical and plant-based changes. And this is what we're trying to illustrate in this set of diagrams. This process intended to create a set of open-ended results. The process of pruning will be a form of questioning, with the plant giving a response that can be deciphered through sensing and other modes of measuring. How much and what type of growth results from the pruning in terms of the size of leaves and the nature of branching patterns? Does the new growth differ in color from the old? How do before and after readings of this compare? The results will likely suggest adjustments to the pruning process. So, as previously mentioned, we've taken inspiration from the work of artists and engineers like Jean Tanguy and Natalie Jeremchenko. Jeremchenko has often directed her work toward the health of all species and toward the introduction of ways that humans can more fully understand the individuality and sensory experience of non-human species. Tanguy found humor and inspiration in the open-ended freedom of his revolutionary kinetic machine sculptures, which you can see here. The freedom appeared as a result of a range of intentional oddities in their function, achieved through asynchronous motors, interaction with spectators, or intentional mistakes in their construction. This was occasionally disastrous, as in the case of the infamous homage to New York at the Museum of Modern Art in 1960, yet typically led to surprising, sometimes hilarious, and almost unexpectedly beautiful actions on the part of the machines. What was also unexpected was the response of audiences who found themselves now questioning their own motivations and responses to this wild show. So our aspiration moving forward is to use this prototyping platform in collaboration with others to create our own communication with different plant species and growing medium in relation to internal and external environmental data, to then produce a nascent language and to choreograph our own wild show. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you see my screen? My name is Guoping Huang, and my project is called the Geosocial Image of the City. It has been exactly 60 years since Kevin Lynch published his book, The Image of the City, a classic in urban design, urban planning, and environmental psychology. His groundbreaking work demanded planners to pay more attention to those who live in a place and to the actual human experience in a city. The method he used is well known today as a mental mapping. His research was done, in his words, by a small group with no training in the method at all. But the result reveals what he called legibility of the city, the extent to which the cityscape can be read. Now, with explosive growth of social media data, especially those with geospatial location, we have a new array of methods and techniques to understand our city. My study is done by an extremely large group instead, but also with no training. The data feed from this group is both spontaneous because of the simple action of sharing on social media, and refined or selective because of the so-called psychology of sharing on social media. My study focuses on the same area, the city of Boston, and the result of my map and my study reveals shareability of our city, the extent to which the cityscape can be read and shared. I used very different web scraping techniques and scripts to collect data from different popular social media sites and apps. This is one example showing variables I used to scrape data from Flickr, a popular app among amateur and professional photographers. In order to get the most from the data points, I developed a custom viewshed tool to map the coverage of each photo on the web over a digital surface model of Boston built from LiDAR data. You can see the surfaces of different geographical objects covered by this photo, including water body, trees, and unpaved John Hancock building mapped on this viewshed map. John Hancock building here. The whole process is very much like doing flash photography in darkness. Some areas will be exposed. Some areas will be exposed every time. If I continuously do this for thousands, tens of thousands of photos, the result shows how much exposure different spaces and structures of the city get on Flickr. First, for example, when I first looked at the result, I was kind of puzzled by why this particular area get so much attention on Flickr. And then I realized that it's actually the launch site of a famous duck tour in Boston. Lots of photographs in that area. And now let me add the second app, Strava, which is a very popular health and fitness app. Strava documents routes of walking, cycling, kayaking, for mostly fitness purpose, but also for in some cases sightseeing, shopping, etc. This additional linear representation of popularity of different spaces gives us good opportunity for comparison between Kevin Lynch's mental map and my social media map. So in Kevin Lynch's study, he identified 5 elements: paths as channels along which the observer customarily, occasionally, or potentially moves. And here you can see that the geosocial mapping of Strava data almost replicated those paths identified by Lynch in the 60s. So you can see that no matter how things or mode of transportation have changed over the last 60 years, those complete streets with trees, wide sidewalks, and right proportion still play an important role in framing the city in our perception. Node is the strategic point in a city into which an observer can enter, and which are the intensive foresee to and from which he is traveling. Landmark in Lynch definition is another type of point of reference built in. This case, the observer does not really enter within them, they are external. So here you can see how the representation of node and landmark has changed on my geosocial media mapping. And node, you can see the node receive lots of exposure from different directions, and the landmark is highlighted by these high exposure facades. You can see, even though many buildings have changed, but some buildings do stay. For example, the old John Hancock building here, but lots of new landmark buildings as the new John Hancock building here. Edge is the linear element. not used or considered as paths, but they are often boundaries between two faces or linear breaks in continuity. On the original Lynch's map, there are two edges identified around the city of Boston. Both of them are on the water body, defines the boundary of the city. As you notice that the edges becomes less defined as you move up to the north of the city. And in my geosocial mapping, you can understand why it becomes less defined, simply because those spaces are much less exposed in the social media, and as you move north, spaces just becomes a lot more less defined. The only element that is not revealed in my geosocial media mapping is the district, but I used a different approach to do that. So I included more social media sites or apps, including TripAdvisor and Yelp. Both are very popular among travelers and shoppers and diners. They reveal very, very different kind of social spaces. I just basically collect all the data points from these apps, and I created a density map in three-dimensional environment. Imagine that if the actual physical building volume represent the density of human activities in our city, like I showed here in gray, these are actual buildings. Those pink structures on this map represent the density of social media activities in our city. You can see that some districts are overrepresented on social media, and some districts are actually underrepresented. In other words, those are the areas that receive a lot less attention on social media, sometimes very unproportional to its actual physical presence. Please remember that even though I'm making this virtual city of geosocial media, it has a lot of real world implications, especially during this lockdown, during this big pandemic. People spend more time in our virtual city on social media than actual physical city. For example, popular sites will get more businesses, a better infrastructure, and more attention. Less popular sites will get less businesses, less attention. And this is what I call the Matthew effect of accumulated advantage or disadvantage in this era of social media. Many early pioneers of internet dreamed it to be a place of equality. Everybody has equal access and equal voice. This is known as cyber utopianism. What I showed here in my geosocial media mapping reveals that unfortunately we might have just created a more biased city on social media. Finally, all the data visualizations I have made in the project are published to the website, which is, you can see the URL here, and also it's available on the Smart Environment, the main website. Thank you.